All right. Well, hello, everybody. Good evening. We've got Rubio on the call now, and I want to introduce myself. My name is Cabot Phillips. I'm the editor-in-chief for the Leadership Institute, campusreform.org. So we're so grateful to everyone for joining us tonight on this Townhall session. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the growing threat that China poses to our higher education system specifically, and what they're trying to do around the country, and what the Chinese need for the next generation of Americans. And so Senator Rubio is the perfect person to talk about that with his work in DC and on a global stage as well. And so before I get to Senator Rubio, I want to first tell you a little bit about the Leadership Institute. We're so grateful, first and foremost, to all of our donors for making wonderful events like this possible. If you don't know the Leadership Institute, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we don't endorse candidates or legislation, but we do offer top-notch political training and helping the next generation get started in the grassroots political movement. So head over to leadershipinstitute.org if you want to learn more about that. And at Campus Reform, we are an online watchdog exposing what's going on college campuses, holding universities accountable, making sure that they're fostering free speech and all the things that the university system should be doing. So if you're a college student that wants to get involved and help fight back against bias and indoctrination and help defend free speech on campus, head over to campusreform.org. And so at that, we're going to get into our conversation here with Senator Rubio. So we're going to let him have the floor for a little bit for some opening remarks. And then after that, we will go to some Q&A feature. So during the conversation, if you hear anything that piques your interest, you can head to the live chat feature at the bottom of your screen. You can put in any questions there. We'll try and get to as many live questions as possible. Just put your name, your university, and we'll read off your question as many as we can. But in the meantime, Senator Rubio, I'm going to hand it over to you for some opening remarks. Take as long or as little as you want. We appreciate you being with us again. And after that, we'll get right into some questions.
Thank you. And I apologize. I hope you can hear me well. The connection here is not the best.
We can hear you just fine.
All right, good. Well, thank you for the opportunity to address you on this very important topic. You know, it's one that's received a lot of attention. And I just want to talk first about, just in general terms, about the challenges before us. The 21st century, I think, will be defined by the relationship between the United States and China. And there has been a consensus in American public policy that spans the political the spectrum, that when China got richer and when China got more prosperous, that they would become more like us, and that we would have a partner to work with on the global stage on a series of issues. That unfortunately has not turned out to be the case. I think, as we have learned over time, China's rise, they're going to be a rich and powerful country, so let's accept that. This is not about containing China, but China's rise has oftentimes come as a result of unfair practices, both in commerce and also in technology and in other fields. So as an example, today, Chinese companies have protected their marketplace. It's very difficult for US business to enter the Chinese marketplace, or any business for that matter, but they're allowed to do anything they want in other countries. To the extent businesses have been allowed to operate in China, it's often required that they partner with a Chinese counterpart. And in many cases, once the trade secrets of that company, or once the Chinese company learns to do what the foreign company does, they kick you out and put you out of business. Likewise, we have seen state subsidies and funding of companies who then go around the world competing and undercutting. So for American and other companies. So for example, they'll enter a marketplace because they are in construction, and their prices are lower than everybody else's because they don't have to make a profit. They are subsidized by the state. But the net impact of that is you put more and more people out of business. And then ultimately you begin to establish a monopoly position in an industry, or at least a prominent position, or a dominant position in those industries. And then there are the things we have voluntarily given up on. A series of manufacturing and industrial capacities, and for that matter, biomedical capacities, that were moved and offshored to China because it would be cheaper and therefore more efficient to do it there. But the result has been not just an erosion of that capacity in our country, but the loss of the jobs that come associated with it. So it's important to distinguish between falling behind or losing competitive advantage with another nation because they out-innovated us, they outworked us, and they out-hustled that. But another is as a result of directed state policies designed to reach the net outcome of dominating these industries in the 21st century. One is a product of competition, and the other is a product of unfairness and in many cases a violation of international norms. So that is an enormous challenge that we face moving forward, some of which has been brought to the fore during this pandemic. Added to that, of course, is a Chinese effort to expand their influence globally. And we have seen that now in a number of international institutions where there's now legitimate concern from the World Health Organization to the International Criminal Court to other places that they have used political power, funding, and leverage to gain an advantage in those industries, or sorry, to gain an advantage in those forums at the expense of the rest of the world. But the one we want to focus on tonight with each of you is the role they've played in academia. And that role is threefold. The first is, I think they're very interested in research and technology. And I think this is a topic we should always tread on very carefully. Because on the one hand, I do not support xenophobia of any kind. I do not think that we should assume automatically that anyone, because they happen to be from China or the parents are from China or in any way related to China, that they are automatically suspected of being spies. I still believe that the vast majority of Chinese students study in the United States because they want to go to our universities, some because they admire our society and may want to stay here afterwards, and because and it's an exciting opportunity to go and learn somewhere outside your own country, and certainly in the United States, our higher education system is very attractive. We cannot, however, ignore the fact that there have been numerous cases of people sent here from China or coming here from China as students, particularly in the graduate level in certain fields, who have ultimately been responsible for the theft of intellectual property and research that they've had access to that they take back to their country. Now, let me say this, in some cases, they're completely unwitting. They are ordered to do so and told to do so. In other cases, they view it as a patriotic duty. But it would be unfair to put the blame solely on them. We have also seen examples of universities and even researchers who have turned over this information to China, some, frankly, because of enormous financial compensation. We saw multiple cases throughout the years of sometimes federally funded research that is then bought by a Chinese university and transferred over there. So that's obviously a practice that needs to be tightened up. The second place where you've seen influence in academia is on freedom of speech. And we have seen in multiple campuses across the country where if your university has a presence, say a big study program or even a satellite campus in China, and you decide that you're going to hold or sponsor a forum at your university to talk about the Dalai Lama in Tibet or Hong Kong or what have you, that they will now threaten your relationship with them as a result of it. Some of this has come about through Confucius Institutes as well, who in many cases have organized sort of counter protests and so forth, and pressure campaigns against professors and organizations on campus, and in many cases who have been asked to tone down or not host certain events because it will upset the Chinese government via the Confucius Institutes. And the last part about the influence is they're very interested in young Americans and in influencing the narrative and the view of China that young Americans have, because they know that younger Americans in universities today are students, but tomorrow's are going to be captains of industry. They're going to be people in political office, influential members of the media, and commentators and the like. So this is a long game, but it's a way to influence towards their narrative in events. The people who one day will be in positions of leadership. It's a long-term contribution, and it's one that we've seen them also employ on local elected officials at cities, states, and counties, because they also view these as future leaders at the national level they can try to influence. So it's a multifaceted threat, and it's one that we need to recognize that exists. And it is not, in many cases, your traditional espionage. This is not James Bond coming down the side of a building, stealing some military secret. Sometimes it's commercial, and sometimes it has to do with innovative, cutting-edge research that they want access to. Sometimes these things are happening through cyber intrusions, not just because somebody's physically present, but oftentimes it's because they're buying the technology, they're buying the researcher to move to China and the cutting-edge research, even though the American taxpayer contributed to its start. Sometimes it's the ability to get someone working at a company to turn over some of this information. So it's a threat that we've begun to finally wake up to and need to adjust to. I can assure you that if we tried to do the same thing in the other direction, it would not happen and it would not work. So it's something that I think that it all begins by making people aware that this is out there and that this is happening. because only through that awareness can we begin to address the threat that this poses on multiple fronts, and has a direct influence not just on our future policies towards China, but also our capabilities in the future from a technological standpoint and so forth. I'll close with this, that my goal is not to have conflict with China. Now, listen, I'm never going to walk away from issues of human rights that I care deeply about simply because it will upset the relationship with China. But we're going to have a relationship with China, but it needs to be a balanced one, because if it becomes an inequitable relationship, an increasingly unbalanced relationship on multiple fronts, then the prospects of real conflict, including armed conflict, potentially begin to rise substantially. And I can't imagine anything that would be worse than a direct conflict or a Cold War, even with China. That is not my goal, but we do need to address these issues, because this relationship is not headed in a balanced direction and poses a direct threat to our national viability, our national vitality, to our national security, to our national economic capabilities. And it's not the work of one administration, not the work of one Congress. It's going to be the work of a generation. Getting this relationship right will determine so much of what's going to happen for the rest of this century and perhaps beyond. And many of you, as you go on in your careers, will play a leading role in determining that. But I encourage you to be aware of it and participate in it even now.
And so you touch on how this is kind of a generational struggle and how this needs to be something that the entire next generation is aware of. I think in talking to a lot of people in the next generation, a lot of people in my generation as well, I think there's a lack of concern about this, and there's kind of a brushing off of the impact China feels. People think a lot of times, oh, it's just some country over there, doesn't really impact me. Can you talk a little bit about how it does impact young people, especially, and how it's going to impact them moving forward to try and, I guess, wake them up to why it is an issue?
Yeah, and I apologize because it's for whatever reason, it's breaking up when I'm listening to you, but I got the gist of it. How's it going to impact the young people? I encourage you to look at Made in China 2025. It is an industrial plan put out by the Chinese Communist Party, where they basically detail the 10 industries that they intend to be the world's leader in. And you may say to yourself, well, first of all, I think that's a call to action on our part. And that means that we have to ensure that we have our own capabilities and that we're investing and prioritizing in these key industries like biomedicine, like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, telecommunications, but also things like rail and clean energy and all sorts of other industries that they intend to be dominant in the world, because we want to have those capabilities as well. And we don't want to be dependent on China for them. It gives them tremendous leverage over the rest of our country. But here's the second thing I would say. I'll give you a perfect example. In 5G, the reason why 5G is so important is that whichever company or country sort of establishes core presence in that, becomes the world leader in 5G, will also set the standards for 5G. And that means all of the technologies that depend on 5G will have to be written to those standards. So as an example, additive manufacturing or driverless cars, these things that we're going to see in the future, all will require 5G connections. And all of the if China becomes the world's dominant presence in the 5G space, then all of the driverless cars, all of the companies that are doing additive manufacturing, like the 3D printing and the like, are all going to have to meet the Chinese standards. Now, guess which companies on this planet are going to have an advantage meeting those standards? And that means that if you're interested in a career in those industries or industries related to that, you should be concerned about it. It has a real impact on your future. This country has benefited tremendously from the innovation that's come out of Silicon Valley and our technology sector and the like. They seek to dominate the next wave of innovations. And if they do, they will benefit from the jobs that result from that. So that means that some of the good paying careers that many of you might be interested in will increasingly be not located here, but might be located somewhere else, including in China. So that requires us to do two things. Number one is not allow the innovations that we're coming up with to be stolen. But the second is not to be out hustled on this front, to in essence ensure that we are prioritizing these industries and investing in the appropriate way in the public and private sector, so that we can be competitive in that field and have a presence in the world in these industries that will be the dominant industries of the 21st century.
So we want to get to a video question now from Stefan at Baylor. So Stefan, go ahead and video in now and introduce yourself and go ahead and ask your question for the senator. Stefan might be having some video problems. That seems to be the quarantine theme for technology. So while we're waiting on that, I'll go to the next question, which is a written question from Ada Enriquez at the University of Puerto Rico. Ada asks, part of China's increasing influence is due to the massive production of goods, including the antibiotics we consume. Should the IRS code treat U.S. territories as U.S. soil in order to bring back the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, I think she's touching on a point that directly relates to Puerto Rico. And in fact, we're finalizing a bill that reinstates the policies that once made Puerto Rico a vibrant pharmaceutical, once had a vibrant pharmaceutical industry presence in Puerto Rico. To me, it makes all the sense in the world for two reasons. Number one, we need more domestic capabilities in that field. As this recent pandemic has proven, we need to improve our own domestic capabilities. As I think you're going to see a growing amount of biomedical nationalism around the world because countries have faced the abyss of running out of materials and are going to look for ways to be able to produce more of it themselves. We're going to have that same capability, but also because it produces great jobs. But the other thing, and this is why this is a 2-for-1, it will also help with Puerto Rico's economic recovery by producing high-paying jobs available to the graduates in Puerto Rico and those who seek to return from the mainland and back to the island. So to me, it makes all the sense in the world. It helps, it fits a need that our country has, and it also helps to deal with the need to help Puerto Rico recover economically after a financial crisis, 2 terrible storms, and an earthquake. It's been a tough 5 years.
All right, we got Stefan or Steven, I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, queued up now. So go ahead and ask your question, introduce yourself to the senator.
Hey, Senator Rubio, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Hey, Stefan, thank you.
My name is Stefan Fitting. I'm from Baylor University. I'm the Training Development Coordinator for the Young Conservatives of Texas. And I'm just wondering, American grand strategy towards China and education here has typically been to count on our education system to install the Chinese foreign exchange students with our values and hope that it transfers over to China. Do you think there's any hope of us balancing this strategy while we still protect our own education system, or do you think we need to go an entirely different route?
Well, I think that, first of all, that reality has changed. And look, anytime you speak about this, I always avoid generalizations, okay? I personally know students from China that are studying in the United States, for example, because they want to study at a faith-based institution, because they're Christians, for example, and they're not allowed to do that in their own country. And I by no means am talking about that. But here's the truth. Many and a growing number of Chinese students in the United States do not get the full university experience. There is, and we know there is, active monitoring on behalf of Chinese embassies and other programs to keep an eye on foreign nationals that have traveled to the United States to, in essence, in their theory, prevent them from becoming infected with Western ideas about freedom, democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, and the like. So this is not the same as it was 20 years ago. And I don't think we should be overconfident in believing that simply allowing people to study at our universities allows them to have the full experience, as you've outlined a moment ago. But primarily, what we have always counted on is that if you go to a university campus, by no means are any of them following the standard American government line. As you all well know, if you're at a university, universities are not necessarily bastions of orthodoxy in their thinking. They're but ultimately, we've always counted on those diversity of a plurality of opinions in our society to balance it out. And ultimately, for someone from abroad to see that and say, wow, this is a great country, it functions, and people are allowed to believe all sorts of different things and have different opinions and not be punished for it. I don't believe Chinese students are getting that experience any longer when they come to the US, primarily because I think they're being watched and carefully monitored for that sort of activity. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That is something that we have been able to document and have seen. And many on campuses will tell you has been a reality as well. So I do think that I do think there is still a benefit to having some relationship with students of some kind, but it will have to look different. I'm not sure I have the perfect solution for it, given these new realities, but I do know that one of the things we're going to have to address, particularly graduate students in certain fields, is we are going to have to be more sensitive about, frankly, allowing foreign nationals of a variety of different places who are known for active efforts to steal trade secrets and technological secrets. We have to be more careful about that sort of thing. But by and large, by no means am I saying that we should discriminate against people because of where their parents came from or because of they're from abroad necessarily. But we're going to have to be a lot more careful about it. And we have to recognize that Chinese students in the US today are not getting the same experience that Chinese students would have gotten coming to the US 20 years ago because of the Chinese government, not because of us.
All right, thanks, Deb, for the question. Going to go now to Connor from UT Austin. So Connor, go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi there, my name's Connor Ellington. I'm a student at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm a member of the Federalist Society. Senator Rubio, as I'm sure you've heard, there have been some reported ties between the communist Chinese government and professors at universities throughout the US. My question is, what should we tell taxpayers that support public universities like mine, that are also financially supporting potentially ethically compromised professors spewing party line talking points from Beijing?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I would refer you to something that most people probably aren't familiar with, but China has a strategy for dominating the future of warfare and becoming the dominant military power in the world. And it's called military civil fusion. And what it basically means is that it blurs the line between civilian research and military research. And unfortunately, some of the graduate students and some of the problems that I've mentioned, postdoctorate, visiting fellows that are coming to the United States are oftentimes doing that in direct support of these types of programs. So you will say that you are working for a company, you are here doing research on behalf of the university, but you come to learn that every major institution in China is controlled by the Communist Party. That university happens to be strongly linked to the People's Liberation Army or some other military branch. And the research ultimately that they are interested in has military applications to it, and that's why they're here. So we just have to be aware of that, you know, when we see that, and has to be something that we have to have some transparency about. I would also say that there's been instances like the professor at Harvard or researchers at the Moffitt Cancer Center in my own home state of Florida, who were deriving a paycheck from their institution, Harvard or Moffitt, but they were also secretly getting a paycheck and sharing the exact same research with an institution in China. And that was not being disclosed. So I think part of the answer here is to require strict disclosure when you are doing research or you are drawing compensation from a foreign state, particularly China, who has a track record of trying to steal research or at a minimum getting you to duplicate it for them. That has to be something that is disclosed, and there need to be criminal penalties for people that deliberately hide it. And there's to be more prosecutions of that, but we also have to have more requirements on that disclosure. And I would say that in addition to transparency on where all this funding is coming from, the freedoms of speech that we continue to have in this country, especially on university campuses, I hope, will also give us the ability to engage on some of these conversations and on some of these discussions. Look, academics they're not entirely to blame for this. They operate in a world in which collaboration is highly valued. And for the most part, for much of history, it's worked out just fine. But things have changed. You are no longer collaborating with a fellow academic. You are collaborating with someone who considers themselves a fellow academic, who behaves in many ways like a fellow academic, has the credentials of a fellow academic. But at the end of the day, this fellow academic works for a company or an institution that will not exist and must do everything they are told to do by the Chinese Communist Party. This is not the same as it is with another country or as it was in the past with China. So there has to be awareness about that, and there has to be conversations about that. And I think campuses should be encouraged to have those open conversations, including among the student body.
So, Senator, you talk about all the ways China's infiltrating campuses earlier. You touched a little bit on Confucius Institutes. That's something that we've gotten a lot of questions on this week of students saying, what do we do about these Confucius Institutes, these Chinese Communist Party funded centers on campuses in America? So posing that question to you, what is the correct course of action here? Is it defunding? Is it straight up saying they can't be on campus? Is it allowing them to be there but watching them? What do you think we should do?
Well, I think, first of all, let me just tell you, just at the core of it, Confucius Institutes are programs of the Chinese Communist Party. They run it through a bunch of different organizations that sound benign, but it is most certainly an effort of the Chinese Communist Party. And in their mind, it is largely an effort to teach Mandarin, invite people to travel to China and visit. It's also a great recruiting opportunity to identify either future leaders or people that they certainly want to influence in terms of their narrative on China. But I will tell you, it's become a growing and important part of their influence efforts in the United States for the future. I think it's important to remember one thing about the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm reading here just because I want to get the order right. They have identified in their mind the things that they consider to be the threats to the country. The Chinese Communist Party has explicitly identified the freedoms of thought, the freedom of speech, the freedom of inquiry. Those three things that are the underpinning of our higher education system, they consider a direct threat to China. They consider something that would disqualify you from a high post in business, and frankly, in many cases, if you take it too far, put you in jail. And people would say, well, this is the talk of a reactionary anti-China politician. I'll quote to you from University of Chicago professor, okay? He has called Confucius Institutes academic malware. And that's because they represent and reflect decidedly illiberal views that ultimately do not create, in essence, run contrary to everything we say university campuses should be about. So I tell you what I have done. And I think one of the first things you can do is you can make universities and schools aware of all of this and ask them to voluntarily cut ties because of the threat they represent. And I can tell you that in the last 2.5 years, every academic institution in Florida who had a Confucius Institute has shut it down. I think that's very effective and it works in many cases. And I also, obviously, I've also introduced a bill called the Foreign Influence Transparency Act, which would require higher education institutions to report gifts or contracts from a foreign source that for $50,000 or more. I would prefer to start along that route before beginning with threats about cutting funding and things of this nature. You usually get better results, even though it takes longer. Because ultimately, if you're forcing people to do it, but they don't know why you're forcing them to do it, eventually the Chinese Communist Party or somebody else will figure out a workaround. I think it's more important that we convince people this is a threat and get them to voluntarily do it before we start bringing down the hammer of threatening cuts to federal funding and the like, which would impact the entire student body, but probably wouldn't impact the Confucius Institute.
Got it. And so for anyone watching here on Zoom or on the YouTube live stream that's wondering, it's the first time you've heard about these, you can go to campusreform.org/China. We have a whole list. There are 75 Confucius Institutes currently operating. We have a whole list so you can see where they are right now. Be sure to check that out. So I want to get to another pre-submitted question that we got through the Q&A feature. If you guys have any questions, continue to submit those through the Q&A chat box there at the bottom. This one is from TJ Ringer. He's a high school student. It says, there is so much talk about holding China accountable, but how can we actually physically hold China accountable?
Well, I think we first have to understand, okay, some balance here. China is a large, second largest economy in the world, soon to be the largest, not per capita, but on a gross level in the world. It is a nuclear power, it is a significant global player, and that's not going to change in your lifetime. You know, China. This is a country that's not going to go backwards in terms of its global influence. So when we talk about what can we do to punish or hold them accountable, we have to be clear about what we're talking about doing here. And first of all, I think it begins by protecting ourselves. So for example, I have something called the Equitable Act. Why? Because Chinese companies are able to list on our stock exchanges. People are investing in these companies, but there's zero transparency into how their books are being managed. So you have a significant, if an American or some other company were to be listed in the stock exchange, you have to meet certain minimum requirements for auditing requirements, you know, the sort of transparency you have to provide investors. Chinese companies refuse to allow the same auditing standards to be applied to them. But yet we have a significant amount of US retirement funds and investment funds flowing into these companies. So A, you're setting up tremendous liability, potential liability to billions of dollars of US retirement funds and investment funds. Number two, in many cases, you are funding or investing in companies that are directly responsible for assisting the Chinese Communist Party in displacing our capabilities and becoming the dominant. So we're funding indirectly in many cases their military against ours. Their stealing of intellectual property, their ability to use it and to develop it to our detriment. Beyond that, I don't think we should walk away from things like human rights and what's happening. And for example, there's upwards of a million or more Uyghur Muslims who are being put in work camps whose names are being stripped, identities are being stripped, they're being forced to change their name. And the world has caught on to this issue and has talked more and more about it. And so I was able to pass, and we were able to get, hopefully here soon, signed into law, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that would prohibit goods that are made from forced labor. And the reality is that it's very, very difficult to trace back some of this, but there's ample evidence out there that there are products being sold in the US marketplace that you can track back to factories in that region, in Xinjiang, and that were made by the forced labor of Uyghur Muslims that were taken into account. So these are the sorts of things that we need to continue to work on. The same with the Hong Kong Accountability Act, where they want to eliminate Hong Kong's autonomy, but they want to continue to benefit economically from the different treatment we give Hong Kong. We don't treat Hong Kong the way we do the goods that come out of China. So they want it both ways. They want to control it, but they don't want the autonomy that justifies that preferential treatment given to Hong Kong in the first place. But if you want to talk about accountability, the number one thing, beyond confronting them in global forums, why did you not share more information with the World Health Organization? Why are you trapping countries around the world in these debt traps? These developing countries where they lend them a bunch of money, they know they can never repay, and then they use it to leverage them in foreign policy to support China, vote with China, and forums, et cetera. But the most important thing that we need to do to deal with all this is take care of our own business. Ensure that we are rebuilding these industrial and technological capabilities and not continuing to allow this erosion because it puts our national security and our national economic interests, especially in the long term, in danger.
So I want to get now to Tanner from the University of Northern Iowa. Tanner, go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Senator Rubio. My name is Tanner, and I'm a student at the University of Northern Iowa, and I'm currently the chapter president chapter leader at Turning Point USA there. And my question to you, sir, is how do you think, or how do you propose to ensure that our American-born students are better integrated into the workforce without debt?
I lost the last piece of your question there. Better integrated into the workforce?
Without debt, I'm sorry.
Without debt. Well, I wish somebody would have figured that out for me before I graduated from, and at the time I had over $100,000 in debt. Today, that's a third or a quarter of what some people are borrowing. That's not an easy question, but there's a couple things that I think are important. One is I have continued to promote something called Right to Know Before You Go, which means that before you take out student loans, we don't prohibit them, but before you take out student loans, you are told how much people make when they graduate with your degree from your school. That doesn't mean the school's bad. It doesn't mean you can't major in it. It doesn't even mean you can't borrow the money. But I think there needs to be at least that information provided to students so they can make a decision. The thing I've also continued to push for, and I've seen a growing amount of ability to do this, is blended learning, where you can package a variety of learning from a variety of sources, including traditional courses at a university, but also credit for life experience, for work experience, for things you might have learned from a variety of different places into the equivalent of a college degree. At the end of the day, what a college degree basically is that an accredited institution certifies that you've taken these courses, and they give you a piece of paper that tells your employer, this person we can certify knows something or learned things because they went through this course study. That'll always be part of the menu. But I also think there needs to be an opportunity to get something like that for people whose learning comes from a variety of sources, including extensive work experience, service abroad, all sorts of places. I think that cuts down on the amount of time people spend at universities and the amount of potentially credits that they have to pay for in order to graduate. That's part of the solution. On top of that, I've continued to explore and push an idea that actually changes the structure of our student loan programs. And that is, right now, the biggest problem with student debt isn't just the gross amount, it is the compounding interest over time. Even if you go into forbearance, that interest continues to grow and at some point becomes unmanageable and you won't be able to pay it. So what we've proposed is that you borrow X amount of money, but then you attach to it a simple and flat fee. Since we're not in the business, we're not a bank. So the federal loans to students is not a money-making venture for the U.S. government. Our interest is to provide a vehicle by which people can pay for their education. So we don't really need to make compounding interest. What we need to do is say, here's how much the loan is, here's the cost of servicing that debt, and attach a flat fee to the loan. So let's just using simple numbers, you borrow $10,000 and $12,000 is the cost of servicing it. The $2,000 is the cost of servicing it. Your total debt is $12,000. It's $12,000 today. It's $12,000 5 years from now, or as you pay it down. But that way you don't have compounding interest. That's what banks do because that's how they want to make money. That's not what the federal government should be doing. We should just attach a fee that covers the cost of processing that loan. In addition to that, I would at least test the concept of not only doing that flat fee on top of the loan, but making it so that the payment amount per month is based upon, as a standard measure, is based upon, not something you apply for, but something that's automatic unless you choose to pay more, is based on how much you earn. So that we're not eating up 35% of someone's income, 40% of someone's income, and locking them out of home ownership and all sorts of other opportunities. At the end of the day, you are better off collecting something on those loans than nothing, which happens when you default and ruin your credit or go into forbearance and the interest compounds. And the other idea we've talked about is the ability to benefit in some of these products that have been innovated in places like Purdue, where especially at the postgraduate level, people can actually borrow money or at least borrow money in a way that someone invests in your future. Instead of taking out a traditional loan, they pay for your education. And then for a defined period of time, 5 to 10 years, you agree to pay them back a percentage of your income. It's almost like investing in an individual. And how that works is, a market out there that views you as a promising student. We think you're going to be very successful. We're willing to pay $100,000 for your education because we think you're going to eventually make $500,000, and over the next 10 years, you will pay us some regulated percentage of your income, but you don't have debt and you don't have this compounding interest. That won't work for everybody. They're going to lose money on some of these. They're going to make money on some of these. And it's a choice. It's just one option among many that people will be able to pick from. But these are the sorts of things that we hope can shake up some of the existing structure, because what we've learned from the last 15 years is simply increasing student aid is not going to be enough, because every time student aid is increased, the tuition and the costs increase to meet it. And it's not necessarily making it easier for people to pay these things off.
So I want to get now to a question that was submitted from San Jose State University, Tom Campbell asked, Senator Rubio, can you please comment on our foreign policy going forward with regard to Taiwan and Hong Kong? And also, can you touch a little bit on China's relationship with countries in Africa, how they're going in and taking advantage of countries there, what we should do? So first Taiwan and Hong Kong, and then China's influence in Africa.
Well, complicated issues, both Hong Kong, and I don't mean to go through it all, but it's a good way to lay the groundwork for it. Hong Kong was a British territory. It was turned over to the Chinese, and it was turned over under a very specific agreement. And that agreement was that there would be one country, China, but two systems. Hong Kong would have one system, China would have the other, economic and political. And so Hong Kong continues to have elections, an independent judiciary, and a free market economics. And it's been of enormous benefit to China. If you look at the way most of their companies access foreign investment, in many cases export products, it's all through Hong Kong. And we have agreed to treat Hong Kong different from China. So even though there might be a tariff, for example, or a restriction on something coming out of China, it doesn't apply to something coming out of Hong Kong. For purposes of commerce, we treat Hong Kong as an independent country. Hong Kong's also become a very attractive place for foreign investment. And one of the reasons is because of these rules. It's a great gateway into the Chinese market while not having to operate under the Chinese laws, but also because it has an independent judiciary, which means if you have a contract with someone and they violate it, you can go to a court and you can get a fair resolution. Well, now you see that the Chinese are beginning to enforce more and more of their control of China. And they argue that it's only political, it's not economic, but that's not the way it's going to be. And so there has to be concern about the fact that the more they interfere in Hong Kong's autonomy, the more likely, increasingly likely it becomes that those courts will be influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. Meaning, if you're an American company against a Chinese vendor, the Chinese vendor is going to get preferential treatment in those courts. And so what we can't allow, again, because it would be completely unbalanced and unfair, is for China to say, we want the benefits of autonomy. We want the benefits of commerce through Hong Kong being treated differently, but we don't want the obligations of autonomy. You can't have it both ways. And if our public policy of giving Hong Kong separate treatment from China is entirely based on Hong Kong's autonomy, if Hong Kong's autonomy goes away, so too should that preferential treatment. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's fairness. It can't be both ways here. On the issue of Taiwan, from a diplomatic standpoint, it is a very delicate issue for the Chinese. So The way we've treated Taiwan historically is we treat them like their own country, but we don't rub it in the Chinese face. But we have arms deals with Taiwan. But that is a democracy. That is a vibrant democracy. And clearly its people do not want, as they just voted for someone and re-elected someone who feels very strongly about this, they do not want to be part of mainland China. They want to be Taiwan. And we have an agreement to defend them if they ever come under attack. And so I think that's why a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I passed a bill that requires the US government to send high-level delegations to Taiwan and to engage with Taiwan to make very clear where the US stands in that relationship. I also think that we should continue to have a vibrant defense relationship with Taiwan, not because Taiwan is going to win an all-out war against the Chinese, but because the more costly it would be for China to forcibly take Taiwan, the less likely they are to do it. And so that's why it's important for us to commit to that capability. The bottom line is you have people in Taiwan that have lived their entire lives in democracy and freedom who have zero interest in being sucked into and forced into a relationship under Chinese rule. And we should not abandon them. It's a commitment we made, and it's a commitment that we need to keep. On the question of Africa, it's interesting because the Chinese have suffered tremendous reputational damage in Africa for a lot of different reasons. But one of them is this debt diplomacy. In essence, they go into a country, they may even find themselves with some corrupt leader. They offer them $10 billion to build a bunch of roads, but it's all loaned. The leader looks good, maybe a couple $100 million under the table for that leader. And then when the country can't pay, now you owe China money. They can destroy you, they can control you, and they force you, now we want you to vote with us at the UN. Now we want you to say that we've done a great job with coronavirus and we don't want you to cut off flights. And it's created tremendous pushback in multiple countries in the region. So look, I think this is a strategy the Chinese have employed in the developing world, but no place more than in Africa. I think the only challenge that I would say as an American policymaker is it's one thing to show up and tell these countries, be careful with the debt diplomacy and so forth. But unless we are offering an alternative to it, obviously not bribery, not debt of our own, but something that at least uses a reasonable amount of US incentives for investment, unless we have a counter, many of these countries who have these needs of development are left kind of hopeless without much of an alternative. So I think it's fine to point this out to these countries, but we have to be more creative. And I hope that we will be in the years to come through programs like OPIC that have now been restructured to create vehicles by which the American private sector has an incentive to offer alternatives to the Chinese debt trap when it comes to investing in the developing world, including primarily in Africa, the youngest continent in the world, and one that in many ways represents the future of the world moving forward.
All right, I want to get now to Joshua, another one of our students from Texas. Joshua, go for it. Go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Senator Rubio. Thank you for your many years of public service. My name is Joshua Lambert from the University of Texas at Austin, Hook 'em Horns, and I'm a member of the Young Conservatives of Texas. My question is, given your position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, what pragmatic steps can the U.S. Congress take to investigate, report, and to respond to China's coordination with the World Health Organization on the downplaying and cover-up of the COVID-19 pandemic and its origin? Thank you.
Well, as the largest donor of the World Health Organization, we should be demanding accountability. And even today, you've already seen reporting, I believe, in the Washington Post about leaked emails about how frustrated the World Health Organization was with the Chinese. They weren't sharing information. If you recall, up until the first 10 days of January, the Chinese government was continuing to insist that there was no evidence that this disease spread from person to person. And I can tell you that not only was that not true, and they knew it to not be true, but the World Health Organization covered for them. And that's just, there were people inside the World Health Organization, because the frontline doctors, the people out in the field, they do great work. It's not them. But then the political leadership of the organization, which is not supposed to be political, was covering for China because they didn't want to upset China, because they didn't want to anger them. That can't continue. If you're going to be the World Health Organization, you can't be a political organization. You can't be an organization influenced by politics, because we're depending on you to serve as a sort of fusion center for the world to respond to things like a pandemic. And we lost about 8 to 10 weeks in this response because we didn't have clear eyes as to what was happening on the ground in China. So that needs to be investigated. In particular, what needs to be investigated is not the doctors and the researchers at the World Health Organization. What needs to be investigated is that the upper echelons of that organization, did they compromise medical and epidemiology information to the world for political reasons because of their desire not to upset the Chinese government? And if we don't have a good answer to that, and there isn't accountability for it, then I don't think the American taxpayer can be asked to continue to fund this organization. I actually believe there are many countries in the world that feel the exact same way. Most countries have taken the approach that, frankly, I think we should take, which is let's solve the pandemic first, but then immediately begin to focus on this World Health Organization issue. I don't think that issue is going away anytime soon. I think you'll see more revelations in the weeks and months to come that will ultimately force more and more countries to respond to this as well.
All right, I want to got to a few more questions here. This one just submitted by Lisa Wu from Colby College. And she asked, what makes China specifically more of a threat to American higher education as opposed to other nations, i.e. Russia, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, look, every nation has companies that engage in corporate espionage to some degree or another. I think the Russian efforts are very different. The Russian efforts are largely geopolitical in nature. Not there's a military component to it, but the Russia thing is a lot more complex. Russian history is very complex, and for a lot of different reasons, there's sort of a sense among top policymakers in Russia that the United States will not respect what they think should be their sphere of influence, that the U.S. is acting as a unipolar power. And then there's the domestic political benefit to Vladimir Putin to be able to tell people, I have restored Russia as a great global power. But at the end of the day, Russia neither has the economic, does not have the economic reach or technological capability in the long term to be the sort of competitor that China is. And I imagine there is Russian espionage in our universities, and I think primarily a lot of that will be driven in some of these key industries, but primarily I think they're interested in things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and military applications that are important to them. The Chinese effort is unlike any other, has no parallel in modern history. It is across the board. It is in virtually every field. They are competing in the field of informational warfare and informational campaigns. They're competing in academia, they're competing in research, they're competing in technology, they're competing militarily, they're competing geopolitically. It's an across the board threat to the United States that has no parallel to it. I'm most certain that there are counterintelligence threats, especially if a university is doing work for the Department of Defense or some key industry from a variety of actors, but there is nothing as big, orchestrated, or complex as the Chinese effort, not just now, but in the history of this country.
All right, got two more questions I want to get to. First, this one from Lorenzo Lopez at the University of Southern California. Lorenzo asks, how will we be able to enforce China's promise to purchase more American agricultural goods? And what consequences should there be if they don't comply?
Frankly, I don't think we can, for a lot of reasons. I think they primarily are, in fact, I don't think they will, because what they committed to buy, there's no way they can buy. I mean, it's far more than they're capable of buying, not to mention import. And so I think what they're counting on is ultimately, when it comes down to it, they won't fulfill the quotas that they promised. And what are we going to do about it? Blow up the whole deal as a result and get back into another trade conflict? I think that's what they're counting on, is to buy time. It's what they've normally done. You buy time, and you deal with it later. But I want to be clear, look, I'm an enormous supporter of agriculture. I want our farmers to have access to markets, but I don't want a world in which the US exports food to China, and in return, China sends us high technology, biomedicine, and all of the other industries that are going to define the 21st century. I don't want that. That's not a good deal. We are become a solely agrarian society in which we are producing food and we're farmers for them, and they in return dominate every other industry. So I think this pandemic reminds us of how blessed we are to have domestic agriculture that can feed our people and the world, and we need to keep that vibrant. I am an enormous supporter of agriculture. It's an incredibly important industry in the state of Florida. But if the deal is we are only exporters of agriculture, and are dependent on them for everything else, that is not a balanced deal, and ultimately won't even be a good deal for the farmer, because once they establish that kind of leverage on us, then they can decide how much they're willing to pay our farmer, or maybe they'll just buy that. They've already bought packing plants in the U.S. They already own some of the major ag-producing packing plants in the United States as is. So I don't think that they're going to fulfill it, and I think ultimately that's why, look, this imbalance with China, particularly on the fields of commerce, is not going to be solved by one trade deal. I mean, this is going to be an ongoing project that's going to continue to require us not just to build our own capabilities, but to continue to address these inequities in which they have their cake and eat it too, where their companies continue to sell and do whatever they want here, but we are not allowed to do the same there. That can't continue, no matter who benefits from it, even here domestically. That is not a sustainable arrangement, and is not one that we can accept.
All right, and final question. This one's shifting gears a little bit. President Trump this week making big news by labeling Antifa, or calling for Antifa to be labeled a domestic terror organization. What do you make of this move? Support it? Oppose it? What do you think?
Well, I want to say this at the outset. Number one, I think there's broad agreement in this country, unlike anything I've ever seen in similar instances, that Mr. Floyd was murdered and that the people responsible for that need to face justice. I hope there's growing awareness, and it's the issue we should be focused on, that this anger that you see among many is not simply because of Mr. Floyd's murder. It is because of a long-standing feeling among a significant percentage of the American family that their lives are valued less and their problems receive less attention because of their race and the color of their skin. That has to be addressed. We as a country cannot fulfill our promise and succeed when a significant percentage of the American family feels that way. And that, we just can't continue to ignore it. That has to be addressed, not through platitudes, but seriously, by confronting it holistically. And ironically enough, unfortunately, in the days before all this happened, I had written a piece in Medium talking about how some of the deindustrialization has harmed minority communities, perhaps more than any other sector of our country. That said, we have to separate those situations, which are what we should be focused on, from what we've seen happening in many protests. And I want to be fair. I know some of these protest organizers through the years. I've engaged with them on a number of issues. They are telling us in city after city, protest organizers and local authorities are telling us, you have protesters that are angry about Mr. Floyd and want racial injustice to be addressed. And then you have some people showing up we've never seen before. We don't know who they are, but they are showing up at these rallies with crowbars. They are showing up with hammers. They are showing up, fully covered with masks, and they're creating acts of violence. I put a picture up today of a guy with a crowbar. Who brings a crowbar to a protest? Why would you bring a crowbar to a march highlighting this injustice? You bring a crowbar because you want to break a window, which was what he was trying to do. And to the credit of many of the protesters, they stopped him and they said, stop doing what you're doing. But it becomes a losing battle. You break the window and now you've got people see it, and all of a sudden it becomes opportunistic. It reflects poorly. It does two things. The first is it's hijacking these protests. It's turning them into something that they're not about. It's distracting our attention away from the issue that we should be focused on 100%, which is the purpose of the protest. But it's also increasingly anarchy. Innocent people are being hurt. You're putting people's lives in danger. Last night, 4 police officers were hurt badly. One of them, as of the last time I checked, was in very, very critical condition. Some reports say on life support, after somebody walked up behind them and shot him in the head. This can't continue. And I don't think anyone can be in favor of that. And I can tell you a lot of the protest organizations are not in favor of that, because that's not what they're doing. That's not what this is about. So I can't look at these images and believe, frankly, that suddenly these people are all showing up with crowbars and hammers and weapons and wearing, what looks like professional protester garb. And they're just organic individuals that happen to show up out of nowhere. No one's ever seen them before. So Antifa is a loose affiliation of anti-capitalist, socialist, communist anarchists who have a well-documented history of violence, along with the Black Bloc protesters, along with an array of groups. Listen, these groups are not, the problem with designating them, which was your question, is they're not an organization. They don't have a PO box. They don't have articles of incorporation. They don't have they're anarchist on one side, but it ranges across the board to, I even hate using the term far left and far right, because I don't think they even fit on a normal political spectrum. Some of these people want to start a second civil war and hate government and some would say they're far right, but they hate Donald Trump, and they're certainly not fans of the Republican Party, and they want to kill police officers. So I just think there's a rogues gallery of all kinds of whack jobs and extremists, some of whom are very violent, that either online or in the street are inciting this. Because at the end of the day, the goal they share, despite the fact that they may have different and sometimes incoherent ideologies, the goal they share is they hate this country and they want to destroy it. They want to bring it down. And they are taking advantage of these legitimate protests and turning them into street riots that obviously are taking our attention away from a valid issue, but are also putting property and lives in danger. And that has to end. That cannot continue.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And I want to get to one final question. You know, it's been a very serious discussion. We really appreciate you joining us, and everyone has benefited from hearing what you have to say. It's been some serious stuff. So I want to lighten it up. One final question. There are two new quarterbacks coming to the state of Florida. We've got Tom Brady for the Bucs and Tua Tagovailoa, who is hopefully going to be the savior for your long-suffering Miami Dolphins fandom. Which team has more wins this year? Or let's say, which team will have more wins in the next 3 years? Because we'll give the Dolphins time to grow.
Well, I think in the next 3 years, it'll be the Miami Dolphins, hopefully, if everything works well. And I hope Tua can serve, you know, in the pantheon of sports figures in South Florida. It was, you know, Dan Marino and Dwayne Wade, and I hope that the next will be Tua. Because I think he gives the fan base someone to be excited about. Obviously, you know, he hasn't played a single professional game yet, so we hope that develops well. But I think if you look at the Tampa Bay Bucs, certainly on paper, they're a very talented team. And, you know, it's not like Tom Brady is taking over a franchise that's bereft of talent. They have good coaching and Bruce Arians, and they have really good talent. So I think they're going to win a lot. I think they're a legitimate Super Bowl contender this year. But I don't care how many, you know, of those nasty shakes Tom Brady drinks. He ain't going to live forever, and he's certainly not going to play forever. So I think over the next 3 years, you'll certainly see the Miami Dolphins probably win more games. I would think, you know, but certainly for this year, I think the Bucs are, if all goes well and things work out the way they should for them, that they are a legitimate Super Bowl contender.
Yeah, I'm not a policy expert, but I would advise you looking into a policy about a stay-at-home order that lasts through like February for Tom Brady's neighborhood. This is stay-at-home order. He doesn't get to leave. But anyways, guys, we really appreciate everyone joining us tonight for this conversation. Senator Rubio, we really appreciate you. I'm going to hand it over to you for a final close-off. If there's any closing marks you want to throw in there.
I
sign off after.
No, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me, and I encourage you all to continue to stay engaged and make a difference. Awesome. Well, Senator Rubio, we appreciate that. If you guys want to come back for another webinar tomorrow night, we've got Congressman Alex Mooney joining us. You can head to leadershipinstitute.org for that. But we appreciate so much Senator Rubio joining us. And at that, we will sign off. Head over to campusreform.org. If you want to keep up on all the latest news about what China is doing, go to campusreform.org/China. If you're a college student that wants to get involved in media, join our website, join our movement. And if you want to get all the top-notch political training for anything you could need to get involved in grassroots politics, head over to leadershipinstitute.org. I want to close off by thanking all of our wonderful donors that have made this possible. And to everyone, have a wonderful evening. Look forward to seeing you guys next time.
Thanks so much for watching this video. To watch our latest video, click here. And to make sure you don't miss any future videos, be sure to subscribe.